The drones descended on the border posts. Shortly after, men with white flags appeared, surrendering to the invading troops who advanced quickly. It all started with small nighttime incursions, testing the enemies and putting their reaction to the test. Then it expanded into what would become a new front. Inside Russia itself, with thousands of square kilometers occupied by the Ukrainian invaders, the Kremlin's armed forces would respond by sending their troops on the ground, deploying their planes to drop bombs, or launching ballistic missiles to strike the enemies. All of this would only lead to more deaths, with rumors of up to 500 of these men sent as reinforcements killed in a single attack in Kursk. Transcription and subtitles letter. The Russians of Kursk took to the streets in 2022 to celebrate the departure of the troops heading south at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Flags with the colors white, blue, and red fluttered as civilians waved happily and filmed the olive-green convoy passing through the streets, with their next destination being the border, perhaps crossing into Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. But celebrating the start of a war is for the fools of war. Only the end is worth celebrating. And maybe more with a feeling of relief than happiness, with the shadow of mourning hanging over. Those men who waved back as they set off on their journey of violence, how many would return? The worst part would be that soon those same Russians would suffer with the war knocking at their door. The violence that went south would rise to the north when all the gunpowder planted would sprout into fire. It was the evil of the war in which Russians and Ukrainians lived, something that can only be lamented and not justified or satisfied like pure revenge. Unfortunate results of storms sown in history's fertile soil. For over 2 years, Russians had entered Ukraine and expanded, a conflict that began in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea and persisted for years, with the Kremlin funding the paramilitary groups that declared the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. What was the war in the Donbas region? It would be drastically expanded throughout eastern and southern Ukraine, and later it would also return to the north of Kharkiv. In August 2024, Russia had taken the initiative on the battlefield, was ahead and taking territories mainly in Donetsk. However, it is important to point out one factor. In 2019, the Russians held 7.3% of Ukrainian land, and in March 2022, they reached a peak of 27%. After the invasion, however, the first Ukrainian counteroffensive was decisive in reducing the occupied forces to about 19% after 1990. In September 2022, it dropped to 18% by March 2024 and stabilized in that area. The estimates spoke of about 109,000 square kilometers occupied by the Russians, far from the peak of 163,000 in March 2022. According to the Russians themselves, in 2024 up until May, this territory was expanded by 880 kilometers. The cost of all this varied depending on what was used in the calculations. For example, a 2023 study estimated the cost of only direct military spending, which could reach almost $132 billion by 2024. The Pentagon estimated about $211 billion. This wouldn't be a reason for Russia to go bankrupt, of course, since its annual military spending budget was $120 billion. Talking about the country's economy would require discussing other factors that don't fit in this video. What is relevant is to highlight the discrepancy between the amounts spent and the gains on the battlefield against a much smaller country that was strictly dependent on external equipment. Of course, this doesn't mean ignoring the fact that Russia was advancing in Donetsk. Defense in an increasingly difficult situation. Over there, the costs for Ukraine were harder to calculate. How do you put a price on entire cities turned into macabre monuments to the gods of war with a declining population and having to rely only on their own soldiers? With the equipment delivered by NATO, the demographic impact was very high. Ah, yes, of course, some would say that it was NATO troops who could do it, but these are the same people who celebrate the real shortage of soldiers, the lack of troop rotation, and the terrible images of men trying to escape recruitment on the Ukrainian streets. All of this led to August 6, 2024, when the first alarms appeared that Russia was being invaded. No, these were not scrawny troops like those from the Belgorod groups. It was something much bolder and more unexpected. The Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2022 was based on many factors, such as surprise and the disorganization of the Russian troops. These characteristics did not exist the following year, which contributed to the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive. Now more preparation was necessary. There was a great silence in this regard, and during that time the sounds of war were heard in other ways. First, with the invasions in Belgorod in 2023 by groups of anti-Putin Russians, such as the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. These incursions tested the Russians' reaction speed and the distribution of their troops. The same happened in 2024. In Kursk, troops from the Russian Volunteer Corps entered Russian territory in regions like Chotkino and the border city of Lozovo-Kursk. Their armored vehicles advanced during a cold period, covered by the veil of night on the country roads. Already knowing where the poorly defended enemy trenches were, the men got out of the armored vehicles, walking carefully in their boots, touching the ground lightly until they spotted the first target. The rifle was aimed at the soldier, calm in his position, and the projectile took him down with a shot to the head. Then the rifles broke the silence for good. The peace of the night. The explosives also flew, filling the small Russian trench with fire. The civilians witnessed this advance. When morning came, they whispered behind the windows about how danger was near and that the government needed to react. Their testimony extended to the sounds of gunfire from the war pounding at their doors. Men ran between the houses looking for shelter from the conflict. Once in position, with the drones identifying the targets, they released their projectiles to dive into the parked Russian equipment. Once the job was done, the soldiers of the Russian Volunteer Corps returned to the forests looking for cover to avoid the drones and artillery. They needed to be quick. There, a new plan for a careful attack was beginning. The troops waited until nightfall so that the coordinates could be relayed and the Russians would think they wouldn't have any problems. Shortly after, other attacks began to emerge. The troops waited until nightfall so that the coordinates could be relayed and the Russians would think they wouldn't have any more problems. The sounds of war spread, shattering the peace of sleep in Kursk. Shortly after, other attacks began to occur, sometimes with a small target like a burning military truck after the attack. July, a column of smoke rose at a military base. The grayish mass rose into the sky long enough for the citizens of Kursk to understand that Ukraine was threatening them. Images from various angles showed that for hours the fire consumed some equipment that supported the Air Force. Shortly after, some channels claimed that the factory, a spare parts factory for tractors in Kursk, was hit by Ukrainian missiles, also sharing a column of flames. There was information that the images were from the same location as a fire that lasted for a long time. Drones started flying toward Kursk more frequently. A communication tower was hit and stopped working. Afterwards, the power substations received similar visits, showing columns of smoke that demonstrated the success of the Ukrainian attacks. This operation was repeated more than once. Substations burned, interrupting the distribution of electricity in cities and villages. South of the Russian Oblast, the fire rose undaunted despite angry protests from Kursk citizens. More antennas were being broken, some in Sudza, a city whose name would soon be recognized around the world. The drones came down and caused chaos in various parts of the oblast. Ukraine had already been attacking Russia's oil production system. This happened again in Kursk. Fires during the local nights became more and more frequent. The sirens announced the attacks. Images of so much destruction circulated on Russian social media. It seemed like it couldn't get any worse. After all, Russian citizens paid their taxes to keep the border well protected. And the Chechens from the Akhmat Battalion, an elite force, were there. In early August 2024, this would be put to the test. That's how the following story begins. And before I tell it, it must be said that it is largely based on images and accounts from the Russians themselves as shown on the screen. On August 6th, the images from Kursk would still show fire and destruction, but with the difference that this time it would be brought by the Ukrainians themselves. The fighting inside Russian territory would be carried out by an invading force in a way that hadn't happened since World War II. On August 6th at 8 a.m. Moscow time, Ukrainian troops crossed the Kursk border. According to Russian information, Kiev's forces passed through the checkpoint at the border, northeast in the direction of Sudza and Olesmia, and in the direction of Nikolaev Udarim. An observation post 10 kilometers from the border was attacked by the Ukrainians. The signs of war were shown by the civilians. There was little information from the Ukrainians. Later, the video of how one of the Russian posts was attacked would be shown. The tanks fired at the facilities, bringing everything down as the soldiers on site called for support. With the roof collapsing and having few weapons to fight back, the men raised white flags. The first surrenders in a series began during the invasion, with the capture of young conscripts and men from the Federal Security Service, the Russian security service that succeeded the KGB. The silence from Kyiv was filled by Russian shouts talking about that invasion. At first, there were those who denied it, claiming that the enemy had no prospects and that it was not an offensive. The Ministry of Defense stated that 300 Ukrainian soldiers from the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, supported by 11 tanks and 20 more armored combat vehicles, launched the attack. By all indications, the invaders were quick, avoiding the work of establishing positions, which would have slowed down the offensive and given the Russians more time to react. They just moved forward. The Russian counterattack did not take long to happen. The planes streaked across the skies of Kursk, flying low to drop their bombs on the Ukrainian forces. The air defense systems brought by the enemies were attacked by Russian missiles. At the Ministry of Defense, at least 2 were destroyed in the attacks, something that would considerably help the Air Force to put pressure on the Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian armored vehicles started exploding in Kursk, the metal breaking apart and being left in the fields. The Lancet drones flew in for their mandatory participation in the Russian attacks. One of the first filmed victims was a bomb transport armored vehicle, the Kozak-2, produced in Ukraine. The Russian Ministry of Defense itself said that the attack was repelled, but the Ukrainian footage showed otherwise. An explosion in Sudze showed that the soldiers from Kyiv were close. A house used as a military base was hit in the village of Honcharivka. Unlike other parts of the front, Kyiv's forces released few images of their attacks. The presence or success in expanding the controlled area was shown by the Russians who were captured or surrendered. On August 7th, the Ministry of Defense announced that they had succeeded in preventing the Ukrainians from advancing further into Russian territory. However, there was something strange about all of this. The same post stated that 260 enemy fighters were killed and more than 50 vehicles were destroyed, which would have completely wiped out the invading force described by the ministry itself. The day before, there were far more Ukrainians than was originally stated. The Russians themselves began to reveal part of the enemy's strategy. By the next day, the Ukrainians had already advanced more than 10 kilometers. Inside Kursk, scout battalions approached the Russian lines with a tactic of clearing the Russian skies under a barrage of fire. Electronic warfare devices were brought in and took down the Kremlin's drones, as well as a large number of UAVs that took down the Russian observers in the sky. Not by coincidence, more images of this kind began to appear in July and August. Modified drones exploded near Zala Orlan, flying at over 100 km/h, taking out the Russian observers. Soon after, modified Mavic drones appeared with plates to increase frequency range and withstand Russian electronic interference. These swarms of fire and death descended upon the Russians, while the armored vehicles kept advancing, until finally the Ukrainian groups settled into the Russian trenches, now empty. The strategy was repeated to the point where the area controlled by the Ukrainians had already increased significantly to at least 250 square kilometers. The Russian ministry claimed that it had now destroyed twice as many troops as it had estimated the Ukrainians used at the beginning of the invasion, with images shown by Russian conscripts, young men who did not go to Ukraine and had little training. They made it clear they couldn't defend themselves. But the Russian reinforcements had solid weapons, not to set Ukrainian equipment on fire. The Skander launchers kept adjusting, using drone images to calculate the areas where the missiles should land. The arrival of the ballistic missiles was significant for the Ukrainian efforts. Warheads of up to 700 kgs exploded over the armored vehicles, leaving wounded men and twisted steel. On the roads of Kursk, drones marked targets to be blown up by Russian weapons from a distance. The expanding bright spots from the explosions were captured by the lenses in the sky, showing that the Kremlin armed forces reaction was having some effect. On August 9th, an anti-terrorist operational regime under the command of the Federal Security Service was introduced in the regions of Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod. But on the following day, calculations showed that the Ukrainians had already occupied more than 650 square kilometers of Kursk. Russian troops moved, with images appearing on television to show the government's effort to contain the threat. The soldiers themselves filmed their movement. Maybe these are drone images, or perhaps the rumors that the Ukrainians hacked the Kursk surveillance cameras. It's the men and their spirits. The lucky ones ran away, desperately retreating to the surrounding houses, hearing the screams of their companions burning in flames and the explosions of the new arrivals. The results were shown by the fire burning strong throughout the night, with men still crying out for their lives under the macabre light. The next day, civilians passed by the column filled with death, with so many corpses still inside the trucks. Reports on the number of dead ranged from 96 to as many as 500 depending on the source. Russian military correspondents called for the execution of those who gave the orders for the columns to move. Russian efforts to stop the Ukrainians were effective, resulting in the destruction of much equipment. However, Kiev's strategy still allowed the advances to continue. Apparently, small groups of scouts were sent to the Kremlin's positions in Kursk to test the reaction and local strength. If there were major problems, they were redirected until they found a weakness, when then the larger force would appear and the Russian helicopter force would spring into action. The K-52S, which caused so much damage to Ukrainian columns during the 2023 counteroffensive, launched their missiles at the enemies. The 9K-121 Vickers capable of penetrating armor could be fired from more than 10 kilometers away from their targets. These powerful helicopters were indeed used, but some of the propaganda footage from the Russian ministry was actually old and geolocated. Elsewhere, Ukrainians showed their own videos of these aircraft being destroyed by man-portable air defense systems, something that was missing in the previous year's counteroffensive. The Mi-28 helicopters took part in the fighting in the same way, firing their S-13 rockets or Ataka-V anti-tank missiles. With a range of 6 kilometers and less efficient than the Vickers, these latter ones still caused damage with the impact of their 7 Kg warheads. An interesting fact was that the Ukrainians released footage of drones heading toward the tail engine of a Mi-28, claiming to have shot it down. but without proof of the crash or the damage. Most of the information about the areas of Ukrainian expansion came from war correspondents. Evgeny Podubny was one of these propagandists and a special correspondent for the television channels Russia 24 and Russia 1. The 80th Air Assault Brigade of Ukraine sent a kamikaze drone for a painful encounter with the Russians' car. Badly injured, badly injured. He asked for help from one of the civilians passing by at the time. The propagandist was later hospitalized with serious injuries. Russa was in the skies over Kursk, firing her weapons, trying to stop the Ukrainian advances. The bombs undoubtedly left their marks on the enemy forces stationed at their newly established bases. The drones flew more slowly but efficiently struck a German infantry fighting vehicle, the Marder 1A3. The efficiency of the Russian Air Force led to incidents. The drone was hit from Sudza, one of the cities that apparently was its target. An M8 helicopter opened fire on T-62 tanks, destroying them all. Later, the Ukrainians filmed the steel skeletons of what were, in fact, Russian tanks destroyed by direct fire. Kiev's troops finally reached Sudza still in the first week of the attack, with Sudza's dismantled drones, their Ukrainian target, destroying the infrastructure. The concrete couldn't withstand it, nor could the men's morale. It withstood the pressure, with up to 50 of the soldiers assigned to guard the edges of the city surrendering. The media even reported that Ukraine was already reaching 1,000 prisoners by August 12 and that this was starting to become a problem for Ukrainian logistics. A check of only those who appeared on video showed a count of 265 prisoners. When the Ukrainian flag was raised in Sudza on August 13, Kiev's presence already extended over 1,000 square kilometers and 74 settlements within the Kursk region. The blue and yellow colors had already been inside Russia for over a week, causing the evacuation of more than 70,000 Russian civilians. Up until that moment, with most of the information coming from Russian sources, as shown throughout this report, it was a bold move by Kiev, still without retaliation from the Kremlin. Until that moment, it was difficult to determine Ukraine's objectives. But some claimed it was for exchanging territories in negotiations, while others said it was to withdraw troops from some fronts in the east and south. In those days of the first week, the advance remained strong in Donetsk, still causing horror among Ukrainians in Toretsk. It was necessary to wait and see if this would have any effect and how long the Ukrainians could still hold out inside Kursk. A third hypothesis spoke of a distraction for something bigger, like an offensive in Crimea. It was hard to know how long this would last. Russia still didn't have it. It had a well-organized response, but it was one of the biggest military powers in the world, with an air force and artillery capable of unleashing hell on the invaders. There would still be more to tell, whether about the Chechen forces in action, special forces ambushes, and more fierce fighting inside Kursk.